I came home a little after 4 in the morning, still wearing my coveralls from the night shift at the plant. Grease worked so deep into the creases of my knuckles that no amount of scrubbing gets it all out anymore. The porch light was on. I remember thinking that was strange, because I'm usually the one who turns it off before I leave for work and back on when I get home. And nobody else in that house has ever once reached for that switch. I let myself in through the kitchen door the way I always do, and that's when I found her standing at the counter in one of my late wife's aprons, going through my mail like it belonged to her. My daughter-in-law looked me up and down, wrinkled her nose like I'd tracked something foul across her floor, and said, "God, you smell like a gas station. People like you shouldn't even be allowed in a house this nice." My son was sitting right there at the breakfast bar, scrolling his phone, and he didn't say a word in my defense. Not one word. I set my lunch pail down on the counter, nodded once, and walked past both of them to my room at the back of the house, because they had absolutely no idea that the exhausted old man they'd just humiliated was about to find out exactly what kind of people he'd let move in under his own roof. Welcome back, and thank you for spending part of your morning or your night with me. Before I go any further, tell me down in the comments what town you're listening from, because I read every single one of them, and it means more to me than you probably know that people all over this country take the time to sit with an old man's story. A quick note before we start. Parts of this account have been shaped and softened for the sake of the people still living it, and some details are fictional, dressed up to protect real folks. But the lesson underneath it is as true as anything I've ever poured concrete over. My name is Harold Weiss. I'm 66 years old, and for the last 2 years I have worked the overnight shift at a steel fabrication plant 30 miles outside of Toledo, Ohio, running quality control on structural beams that end up holding up bridges and parking garages and grain elevators all across the Midwest. Before that, for 31 years, I owned that plant. Not worked at it, owned it. Weiss Structural Fabrication. Founded in 1989 with $11,000 I borrowed against my father's pickup truck and a handshake contract for a single highway overpass in Lucas County. I built that company from a rented pole barn into a 140-employee operation that shipped steel to 6 states. And 2 years ago, I sold it. Not because I wanted to, because my late wife Carol was dying, and I needed to be home with her every single day that I had left. And running a company that size does not leave room for that kind of presence. So I sold Weiss Structural to a private equity group out of Columbus for an amount of money that would make most people's eyes water, and I spent every remaining day I had with Carol until the cancer took her 14 months ago. After she was gone, the house felt too big and too quiet, and I have never in my life been a man who can sit still with silence for very long. So I went back to work. Not because I needed the money, my accountant nearly had a stroke when I told him, but because a man needs something to do with his hands and his hours, or the grief finds all that empty space and fills it up with something worse. I took an entry-level quality control position at a fabrication plant under my maiden business name, Harold Weiss, instead of H. Carl Weiss, which is what everybody who ever did business with me called me. Nobody at that plant has any idea who I used to be. To them, I'm just Harold, the quiet old guy on nights who's unusually particular about weld tolerances. Around that same time, my son David asked if he and his wife Priya could move into my house for what he called just a few months, while they got back on their feet after he lost his sales job. I said yes. Of course I said yes, because that is what fathers do. And because with Carol gone, I told myself the noise of other people in the house might do me some good. That was 14 months ago. The few months turned into over a year, and somewhere in that year, the dynamic in my own house shifted into something I did not recognize and did not like, and I was too tired, too grieving, too conflict-averse to name it out loud. Priya works from home doing something with marketing that I have never fully understood, and David has been between opportunities for going on 8 months now, though I notice he always has money for new golf clubs and dinners out that I am never invited to. They redecorated my living room without asking. They started referring to Carol's sewing room as the home office. And somewhere along the way, the man who built this house with his own 2 hands, who framed every wall of it himself over 3 summers in the early 90s, became, in their eyes, an inconvenient old tenant who happened to hold the deed. That night in the kitchen was not the first time Priya had said something like that to me. It was just the first time she'd said it out loud, in full sentences, with David sitting right there. There had been looks before. Sighs when I came home, smelling like the plant floor. A comment once about how I should really think about a retirement community, somewhere more your speed. I had absorbed all of it the way I absorb most things, quietly, filing it away, the way you'd note a crack forming in a foundation, watching to see if it was settling or if it was structural. That night, I went to my room, and I did not sleep. I sat at Carol's old writing desk, the one she used to pay bills at, and I opened my laptop, and I did the thing I know how to do better than almost anything else in this world. I started looking at numbers. See, 31 years of running a fabrication company teaches you to read financial statements the way some men read box scores. It becomes instinct. And something had been nagging at the back of my mind for months about David and Priya, a small itch I had been too polite to scratch. So that night, at 4:40 in the morning, still in my coveralls, I logged into the joint checking account I had, admittedly, against my own better judgment, added David to 2 years ago, just in case of emergencies. I had never once looked at the activity on it. I trusted my son. That is not a mistake I regret making, because trust is not supposed to require surveillance. But that night, I looked. What I found made my stomach drop the way it used to drop when an inspector called about a failed weld on a bridge deck. There were transfers, dozens of them over the past 10 months, moving out of that account and into something called Meridian Capital Partners, in amounts ranging from $800 to $4,000. I did not recognize the name. I am a careful man, so instead of confronting anybody at 4 in the morning on adrenaline and no sleep, I did what I have always done when something doesn't add up. I built a paper trail. Over the following 2 weeks, I worked my night shifts, came home, said good morning politely to whoever was in the kitchen, and then quietly kept pulling threads. Meridian Capital Partners, it turned out, was not a real investment firm. It was registered as an LLC out of Nevada 18 months earlier, and the registered agent's name, when I cross-referenced it against county records back here in Ohio, connected directly to a man named Gregory Salas, Priya's older brother. Gregory had been in and out of my house a handful of times over the past year, always polished, always talking in the confident half-sentences of a man who wants you to assume he knows more than he's saying. I remembered him mentioning, at Thanksgiving, something about helping people build passive income through a private lending fund. At the time, I'd nodded and passed the potatoes, because that is what you do at Thanksgiving. I had not thought about it since. Public business filings in Nevada are a wonderful thing if you know how to read them, and 31 years of due diligence on subcontractors had taught me exactly how. Meridian Capital Partners had no actual assets, no verifiable fund, no SEC registration. Despite Gregory soliciting money from at least 11 other people that I could identify through a private online forum where 2 of them had posted increasingly frantic questions about delayed distribution payments. It was, in the plainest terms I know, a Ponzi scheme, and my son had been feeding it money out of an account with my name on it for the better part of a year, chasing promised returns of 18% a month that no legitimate investment on earth pays. But it was worse than that, because when I dug into how much David had actually put in, cross-referenced against how much debt had accumulated on 2 credit cards I did not even know he'd opened using our shared address, I understood something else. David was not simply a foolish investor. David was underwater by nearly $90,000, and he had told nobody, least of all his own father, the man he was living with rent-free, the man he had let his own wife call a low-class freeloader in his own kitchen, without saying a single word to defend him. I sat with that for 3 days before I did anything. I want to be honest about that, because I think patience gets romanticized sometimes as a virtue, when really, it is often just fear in a nicer coat. I was afraid of what confronting my son would break that might not go back together. I was afraid, too, of what it would mean about the year I'd spent letting his wife speak to me the way she'd been speaking to me. If it turned out the real story underneath it all was that my son was drowning and too proud or too ashamed to reach for the rope I was standing right there holding. On the 4th day, a Saturday, I asked David to come with me on a drive, just the 2 of us, the way we used to when he was a teenager and needed to talk about something he couldn't say across a dinner table. We drove out past the old plant, the original pole barn that's now a tire distribution warehouse, and I told him everything I'd found. Not with anger. I want to be clear about that, because anger was not what I felt sitting in that truck. What I felt was closer to grief, the same shape of grief I'd carried out of Carol's hospital room, the grief of watching someone you love disappear, a little at a time, and not being able to stop it. David did not deny any of it. He put his face in his hands right there in the passenger seat and told me things came apart slowly, that Gregory had been so convincing, that the first two distributions had actually paid out and felt like free money, and that by the time he understood it was a trap, he was already too deep to climb out without admitting failure to everyone, especially to Priya, especially to me. You built an entire company from nothing, he said, his voice breaking in a way I hadn't heard since he was 9 years old and broke his arm falling out of the maple tree in the backyard. How was I supposed to tell you I lost $90,000 to my own brother-in-law's fake investment fund? I told him the same thing I am telling you now, whoever you are, wherever you're listening from this morning. Shame only survives in silence. The moment you say the true thing out loud to somebody who loves you, it starts losing its grip. I told him I was not angry that he'd made a mistake. Every man alive has made an expensive one. I was only sorry it had taken him this long to trust me with it, and sorrier still that in the meantime he had let his own wife treat his father like something scraped off the bottom of a work boot, because pride had convinced him he had no standing left to speak up. But David was not the only conversation I needed to have. Priya was. I want to tell you something about how these situations usually play out in the stories you hear, because I've noticed there's often an expectation of a shouting match, a dramatic unmasking at a dinner table with everybody's face going pale. That is not how I handle things, and honestly, I don't think loud is where real power lies. Loud is what people reach for when they don't actually have the ground beneath them. I've built things my whole life. Buildings do not go up because somebody yelled at the steel. They go up because somebody understood the load-bearing math and respected it. So on a Tuesday evening, I asked Priya to sit down with me at the kitchen table, the same table where she'd called me a low-class freeloader 9 days earlier, and I laid out 3 folders. The first had the LLC filings for Meridian Capital Partners. The second had bank statements showing the transfers, the dates, the amounts, all of it traced back to her brother's registered agent address. The third had screen-captured messages, provided to me voluntarily and painfully by David, in which Gregory had specifically instructed David not to worry your dad with the details. He wouldn't understand this kind of opportunity anyway. Priya's face did something I will remember for a long time. It went from confusion to disbelief to something that looked almost like physical pain, like watching a structure you trusted start to sway. Gregory told me he'd tripled his own money, she said, very quietly. He told me it was helping people. I did not need to say anything cruel to her in that moment. The folders said it for me. I simply told her that her brother owed my son $91,400, that I had already spoken to an attorney about our legal options, and that whatever happened next between her and her brother was hers to sort out, but that I needed her to understand something clearly, one time, so I would never have to repeat it. I did not build this house, and I did not build the 30 years before it. By being a man, people could speak to however they pleased, simply because I choose not to raise my voice. She started crying, not performative tears, but the kind that come when shame finally gets too heavy to keep holding up alone. She apologized for the kitchen, for the comments before that, for months of quiet contempt she'd allowed herself toward a man she had decided, without ever once asking, wasn't worth her respect. I told her I accepted the apology, and that acceptance and forgetting are 2 very different things, and I intended to do the first without pretending to do the second. Here is the part of this story that I think matters most. The part I keep coming back to on my drives home from the plant at sunrise with the radio off. I did not go after Gregory out of vengeance. I went after him because my son needed a way out of a hole, and because I have spent my whole life believing that when you find rot, you don't paint over it, you dig it out, and you replace it with something sound. I hired the same attorney who used to handle contract disputes for Weiss Structural, a sharp, patient woman named Denise Okafor, and together we built a case that went not just to a civil court, but to the Ohio Division of Securities, because it turned out David was not investor number 1, and he would not have been the last. Gregory Salas is now facing both a civil judgment for restitution and a criminal referral for securities fraud, and 4 other families that I know of, people I have never met, people who trusted a smooth-talking man at a Thanksgiving table the same way my son did, are finally going to see some portion of their money returned, because one tired old man with a green legal pad and 30 years of due diligence habits refused to let it go quietly. I paid off David's $91,000 myself, in full, the same week I found out about it, before any of the legal proceedings had even started, because that is not a debt my son needed to carry one single day longer than necessary while the wheels of justice ground along at their usual pace. I told him it was a loan on paper, with real terms and a real repayment schedule, because I wanted him to feel the dignity of paying it back, not the shame of being rescued. He has made every payment on time since, plus interest, which he insisted on adding himself. David and Priya still live in my house, but something between the 3 of us shifted after that Tuesday at the kitchen table, and it has stayed shifted for the better. Priya asks me questions now about the plant, about the years running Weiss Structural, and she actually listens to the answers instead of waiting for a pause to check her phone. Last month, she asked if I would consider mentoring some of the young project managers at the marketing firm where she works, teaching them how to actually read a balance sheet instead of just repeating buzzwords they heard in a seminar. I said I'd think about it. I'm still thinking about it, though I suspect I already know what I'm going to say. 6 weeks ago, I did something Carol would have loved, something I think she'd been quietly nudging me toward from wherever she is now. I used a portion of what I earned from selling Weiss Structural to establish a small foundation in her name, the Carol Weiss Fund for Late Life Learners, which provides no-interest loans, not handouts, loans to men and women over 50 who want to go back to trade school or finish a certification they abandoned decades ago when life got in the way. I signed the founding paperwork on a Thursday morning in Denise's office, still in my coveralls, because I'd come straight from a night shift. And she looked at me and said, "You know you don't have to keep working nights, Harold. You could do all of this comfortably from a beach chair somewhere." I told her the same thing I'll tell you now. I don't patch roads or check welds for the paycheck, and I don't work nights because I have to. I do it because there is something in a man that needs to build things with his hands until the day he simply cannot anymore, and I intend to keep building for as long as I'm able. I still come home most mornings a little after 4, still smelling like the plant floor, still with grease worked into the creases of my knuckles. But the porch light gets left on for me now, on purpose, by people who understand exactly whose hands built the house that light is hanging on. Nobody has called me a freeloader since. Nobody ever will again. Not because I made them afraid to, but because they finally understand something I have believed my whole life and will believe until the day I die. The quietest man in the room is very often the one who could tell you the exact load rating of every beam holding the ceiling up over your head, and you would do well to remember that before you decide he doesn't belong there. If you're still with me this morning, tell me down below where you're listening from, and if any part of David's story or Priya's story or mine reached something in you, say so, because I read every word and I answer as many as I can. If you believe that quiet integrity is still worth something in a world that mostly rewards noise, stay close, because there is always another story worth telling, and I am nowhere near finished telling them. Thank you for walking this road with me, all the way to the end. It means more than you know,